I've always liked driving, even when it's crazy early in the morning, because I feel like it helps give me time to think and process when a million stressful things are happening. And I think it's one of those things that's so helpful, because even when you've been woken up early to rush out to an emergency, or if you're traveling to deal with something stressful or painful, there's just nothing you can really do to sidestep that journey in between. Journeys are like being held hostage with just yourself. So whether you're traveling across country or across town to see something difficult, there's almost nothing you can do on the way there except for try to make sense of what's happening or try to prepare yourselves emotionally. There's this part in John's gospel right after Mary came back and told Peter that someone had taken Jesus' body, when we see Peter and these other disciples running and sprinting to Jesus' tomb because they didn't waste any time. Immediately after hearing this from Mary, they bolted off at the crack of dawn to see if they could find out who did it. Out the door for this long journey from Bethany to the other side of Jerusalem, knowing that there was nothing they could do about it until they got there. Even if they ran almost the whole way there, they'd have to still go over or around the Mount of Olives just to get there, and it's still a long way to the other side of the Temple Mount. Sometimes I wonder if John had something against Peter, because he includes this odd little detail in his story. He says they were running together, but the other disciple ran faster than Peter and was first to arrive at the tomb. Was he picking on Peter because he's a slow runner, or that he's out of shape, or he's just old compared to the other disciple? Maybe it was a subtle dig at Peter's denial of Jesus earlier that week. But this scene is burned into my mind because of a memory I had from when I was a teenager at my church growing up. We did these huge Easter cantatas, and a friend of mine was playing the role of this eager, swift-footed disciple. And every night with each new performance, he tried to see if he could run faster and jump a little further into the tomb. The performance wasn't exactly 100% biblically accurate, because the way that John tells it, after this marathon running disciple gets there first, he doesn't go in. He actually stands in the opening where the stone has been rolled away, and he bends down to look inside. You see, these ancient tombs like this had multiple chambers, and the goal of burial wasn't actually to preserve for the body as long as possible after death. Jesus was wrapped in burial clothes along with these spices intended to accelerate the breakdown of his body. And because he died on a Friday night and the Sabbath begins at sundown on a Friday night, they had to bury him quickly, and they might not have fully got him buried properly. And so Mary wasn't coming to the tomb to lay flowers at his tomb. She was most likely coming to the tomb to apply another layer of spices to Jesus' body. It was an act of respect, an act of compassion and intimacy. So when the disciple crouched down to look inside, he was trying not just to see into that first room of the tomb, the room where the bones of long deceased family members was. He was trying to see into the back room. The room in the back, the one that has these benches carved into the walls where the wrapped bodies would lay for that first year. Here, Peter finally gets some respect in the story, where this Olympic hurdler of a disciple doesn't actually go into the tomb. He waits and gives that honor to Peter to go in first. But even at the opening, crouched down, he could see the burial clothes just lying in the back room. So when Pokey Peter finally arrives, he goes in first and makes his way to the back. And he sees up close the burial clothes on the ground. But he also sees something that this Usain Bolt of disciples couldn't have seen from the outside. He sees the cloth that they used to cover Jesus' head and his face that they put on him before they wrapped him up. It was rolled up, and it was placed neatly on one of those benches we talked about. Whoever did this took their time with this piece of burial clothing. But this doesn't make any sense. Mary told us that they've taken the Lord from the tomb, and we don't know where they put him. This doesn't look like the work of grave robbers or anyone wanting to tarnish Jesus' reputation. Who takes a body and leaves the clothes that it was wrapped in? It's at this point the Roger Bannister of disciples makes his way into the tomb and ducks his way into the back room. And there John writes down these two sentences that make almost no sense next to each other. He saw and he believed, and then they didn't understand the scripture that Jesus must rise from the dead. The Steve Prefontaine of disciples ducks into the back room. He sees that cloth. He sees the spices. He sees the rolled up head covering. And immediately he believes. But then in the very next sentence, John tells us that he didn't get it. They don't yet understand. What does he believe and yet doesn't understand? You have to remember, these disciples, they've already seen a resurrection. And this to them is not what a resurrection looks like. They saw Lazarus raised from the dead after being in a tomb for 4 days. He was wrapped just like Jesus. He had a cloth over his face and his head just like Jesus. Spices were rubbed on his body just like Jesus. And so when they opened Lazarus's tomb, it stunk. The stench came out. And Jesus yelled to them, "Lazarus, come out!" And Lazarus did. He struggled with his hands and his feet bound, and he's just sort of inching his way out of the tomb, and his face is still covered. He can't really even see where he's going. And Jesus has to get his friends and his family to go and untie him to get him out of these burial clothes. But this scene in Joseph of Arimathea's tomb, it doesn't look like that. The wraps are on the floor. The head covering is rolled up nice and neat and sitting on the bench. There's no stench, no sign of a man struggling. There's no mention of a stench that's coming from the body that was buried there just a couple days ago. This doesn't look like a resurrection to the disciples at all. So what did this disciple believe even though he didn't understand what actually happened? It's a belief that happened immediately when he went in there. Maybe he thought about it on the way there. What am I going to make sense of all this? But he walks into that room and he believes immediately. It's not something he fought for years and had finally come to terms with. He saw it and he believed. So do you remember those opening words from John's gospel? In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. The Word was with God in the beginning. Everything came into being through the Word, and without the Word, nothing came into being. What came into being through the Word was life, and the life was the light for all people. The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness doesn't extinguish the light. This disciple believed immediately that the darkness of Friday did not extinguish the light of Christ. But he didn't think that Jesus had been resurrected. He believed that Jesus had ascended. Like the prophet Elijah, who was taken up to heaven in a chariot of fire, or like Enoch, who simply went on a walk with God and never came back. This disciple believed that this Word made flesh, that this Jesus that was there with God in the beginning, that this Word, this Jesus, was God, and now the Word that once was with God is with God again. He believed that the cross did not annihilate Jesus' life. It was a glorification and a return to God. So he didn't need those old funeral clothes anymore. Resurrected Lazarus, he's going to need those clothes again one day, but not Jesus, not the Word that was with God. Resurrection and ascension aren't mutually exclusive of one another. Both speak to death not having the last word. This one fleet-footed disciple gets that part of it. He just gets it out of order. And so by the time the disciples head back to where they were staying for this Passover festival, the full truth of Easter had still not dawned on them. To me, it feels like this whole experience we're having as a society, as a church right now, is giving us a glimpse of what that first Easter could have felt like. Huddled alone in the dark, in the morning, separated from our community of faith by tragedy and loss, and struggling together to make sense of what has happened. But slowly, as daylight breaks in and the hours pass, faith begins to overtake fear. And we find ourselves surprised by the hope of a resurrection we didn't see coming.